I've made two previous presentations on the early construction stages of Beautiful Dreamer, one at the May meeting and the second one in November. For those who've not seen progress on building this model, including many of our fellow SMS members, I'll recount some of the previous history and progress. I hope those who've heard these before will forgive me for the repetition. Some photos will be out of sequence to help clarify details, and unless otherwise noted, the adhesive used in this description is PVA white glue. My client's father had acquired the fiberglass hull about 45 years ago with the object of finishing and fitting it out. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2023 before completing the project. My client asked me to make a model of the boat in memory of her father. She gave me a somewhat free hand when completing the model, but one particular requirement was that the internal cabin details should be visible if possible. The boat was on its cradle, located in the marina at Midland on Georgian Bay, Lake Huron, about 2.5 hours drive north for me. While I could pay a quick visit, I was not able to free up sufficient time to take off the boat's lines. There are no drawings, but my client had heard that the designer might have been Philip Rhodes of New York. These photos show ground zero as I found it. I took measurements and photographs of the boat and used these to draw up a reasonably accurate shear and half-breadth plan and construction drawings. With frequent reference to the photographs, I also used and modified the body plan of the schooner Anitra that is local to me on Lake Ontario and which I had built a model of a few years ago. Rhodes had built a very successful 48-foot wooden construction ocean-going racing and cruising boat called Thunderhead. While browsing my library some time into the project, I came across a glowing description of Thunderhead in the book A Proper Yacht by Arthur Beiser. But the body plan was missing from that as well, so I only had the shear and half-breadth plan. I suspect that Rhodes had decided to modify her lines to develop a fiberglass production product. Perhaps the hull for Beautiful Dreamer was the prototype he used for detailed design work, after which it would have been discarded. Rather than destroy the bare hull, it might have been available unfinished, and my client's father had acquired it to finish it as Beautiful Dreamer. Using the body sections of Anitra and details of Thunderhead described in the book, I drew up a lines drawing, modified according to my measurements and photos of Beautiful Dreamer. I also constructed a half model, all of which allowed me to make a body plan templates out of styrene sheet. This was to a scale of 1/2 inch to a foot, giving a model 24 inches long with a 6.5-inch beam. I then made frames from steam-bent IKEA spruce glued to the stem, stern and steel and keel backbone, and glued and clipped them onto the outside edges of the templates. Frames located on the starboard side that were to remain in place at the aperture for internal viewing were made from 1/4 inch wide triple laminations of cherry veneer. The frames were strip planked to give a hull shell, and the location of the many topsides fittings were drawn onto an illustration board pattern of the deck. The cabin top was shaped from a piece of basswood. These illustration board patterns were then planked for permanent installation. The sole in the cockpit, that's on the left-hand side, is close-laid strips of cherry veneer. The cabin sole was gussied up a little with cherry veneer planks separated by cream-coloured veneer set on edge to simulate the teak and holly floor fairly common in internal boat flooring. The cockpit and cabin furniture pieces were first mocked up from card. When the card fixtures were made and trimmed to shape, they were used as patterns for the final basswood blocks and sheet constructions. Cabin furnishings on the port side, which will be visible when the model is complete, were laid out. Cooking facilities, cabinets, and navigation and electronic communication tables, and more seating would have been positioned on the starboard side, but on the model, this side was to be left completely clear to allow visibility of the inside. Edges and corners of cabinets below decks were rounded by fitting them with decorative but practical cherry wood corner pieces, as shown here on the partially completed boat. To round the edges of the cockpit seats and lockers, styrene sheet was cut to approximate size, then steam heated before quickly bending and clamping around the furniture blocks. When cool, the shaped styrene was finally stuck to the blocks using spray adhesive and then trimmed to size. Cushions were added to seating and berths. These were made from 1/4 inch thick, that's a scale 6 inches, of basswood and painted with a matte finish paint in a shade called somewhat appropriately Saga Blue. A drop leaf table for the cabin was made from cherry. Other bits and pieces shown on this slide are located in the area in front of the main bulkhead. They include the toilet, a shower partition, and a hand sink with a cabinet. The toilet is carved from lightweight hydrocal and fitted with a wooden seat. The cover shown in the photo was cut out later to show an authentic seat. Half of the inner face of the V-berth partition is covered by a mirror made from 1mm mirrored acrylic, while the starboard half is painted blue, which is conveniently matched almost exactly by the color of a Sharpie blue pen. A fore and aft wood partition is attached to the main bulkhead for privacy, but would prevent visibility of these items on the model. The partition, therefore, was replaced by 2mm acrylic. Strips of 3mm masking tape were first applied to cover the acrylic. Alternate spacer strips were then removed, and the partition was sprayed with Rust-Oleum frosted glass. The remaining masking tape strips were then removed, resulting in vertical clear and semi-transparent stripes on the acrylic, allowing the fittings to be seen. The screen separating the sink unit from the shower cubicle were treated in the same way. The hand basin was carved from hydrocal and is set into a styrene laminated cabinet with simulated doors. The tap unit, representing hot and cold taps and a spout, is made from 1-inch panel pins, cut to size and set into a small styrene sheet base, the whole being mounted adjacent to the sink on the surface of the cabinet. This shows the fittings in position, but not yet fixed. Forward of the head area and separated from it by a partition is the V-berth with mattress cushions. The space in front of the mirrored partition forms the anchor well. While accessible from below through the partition, the working entry is gained from the deck above through a triangular hatch with hinged covers. This hatch cover has been left a tight physical fit, but unsecured to permit viewing of the V-berth if the case cover is lifted. All the bulkheads and partitions have arched entrances for passageway access. The deck is laid in strips of spruce for a reclaimed Venetian blind, again courtesy IKEA, cut to 3 by 3/32 strips. To define and strengthen the shear, a tow rail strip of 3/32 square spruce was glued and pinned into the deck edge, flush with the side planking. Bamboo trunnels drawn down to fit into 0.45mm holes drilled every inch along the outer edges of the deck secured it. The cabin top was shaped from solid basswood with 12-degree sloping sides and a forward face. I sanded this on my 12-inch disc sander with the bed set at the 12-degree angle. To hollow this into a thin shell would require removing the rud with gouges and chisels, a daunting prospect for me that would only marginally be successful in producing a smooth cabin ceiling, but very successful in turning the air blue. This method was therefore rejected in favor of cutting the block into half-inch wide slices on the table saw. Then I used a Dremel sanding drums to remove the inside face of the slices. The drum now being oriented parallel to the workpieces, leaving a thickness of approximately 3/16 of an inch. I also cut out holes for the windows in the sloping side pieces. The slices were then reassembled, replacing the wood removed by the saw blade with strips of 2mm basswood. Gluing and clamping the assembly restored the top to its original width dimensions. Before the cabin top was finally glued in place, interior cabin lighting was to be provided by a length of LED lighting, but more about this later. The keel step mast is represented on the cabin top by a stub length of aerofoil section aluminum tubing. To secure this, I squeezed a short length of circular section tubing to fit and set the free end into a round hole drilled into the cabin top. Inside the cabin, a floor-to-ceiling length of square section basswood was set, representing the keel step mast that was encased in wood in the cabin itself. Below-deck ventilation is provided by Dorade ventilators. The baffle inside these separate rain and spray water that enter the cowl mouths, and the water is diverted back to the deck, allowing the air to pass and ventilate the cabin. On the model, the bases were made from Swiss pear, the sides of which were sanded to a shallow angle. The cowls were made from 30 thou styrene sheet, secured across a frame. This was carefully heated with a propane torch until it sagged slightly. Then the suitably mounted blunt end of a paintbrush was quickly pushed into it to give the basic open bell mouth. Selected bells were trimmed to size and glued to upright styrene tube sections with CA glue, and body filler smoothed the joint. A better method of heating the styrene sheet in the microwave oven was discussed at one of the previous meetings. Skylight frames on the cabin top were constructed from Swiss pear and covered with 1mm frosted acrylic. The main entry hatch roof slides under the fixed weather shield cover set on the cabin top. The traveller base is incorporated into the top of the weather shield cover. A blackened brass strip secured with wire pins into the base will later represent the traveller track. On the boat, removable vertical boards would slide into grooves on the sides of the entrance to close the cabin off. I purchased a Rabesh 20mm 3-blade brass propeller from Cornwall Model Boats. This was epoxied onto a short length of brass wire exiting from the shaft support, which I'll show you later. The rudder, which incorporates a full-length skeg, was sanded to a fat aerofoil shape and was secured in position with wood pins after the hull was painted. Pulpit and pushbit rails were fabricated from scale 1-inch brass wire, that's 0.046, 46 thou brass wire, with soldered intermediate rails. The slope, that's the fore and aft, and the roll, the lateral angles of these, was achieved using a card on which guidelines were drawn while holding the wire in the jaws of my soldering station. Small footplates were soldered onto the ends of the uprights, and 15 thou brass wire pins piercing the footplates eventually secured the structures on the deck. The stains on the wire was removed using wire wool. There was no steering wheel in the boat inventory. I made a model version by annealing scale 0.95, almost 1 inch, brass wire bent round a scale 20-inch diameter mandrel. The bent wire was cut to length and the ends soldered together. 5 spokes from scale 0.67 diameter brass wire were added and laid over a 72-degree paper pattern. This wheel is so small that adjacent soft soldered joints failed as the job progressed. This was mostly due to technique when using my old 10-watt soldering iron, and think silver solder. So I reluctantly resorted to using gel CA. However, after test fitting this wheel, I considered its 20-inch diameter to be visually too small. I therefore made another wheel at scale 3 feet diameter, not uncommon on a boat this size. I was able to solder the spokes to the rim because my new 60-watt soldering iron allowed control of the heat transfer along the spokes. A slice of a suitable brass tube served as the hub, and when filled with black epoxy, it was drilled for a wire spindle. While modern full-size wheels are generally stainless steel or painted, I decided to leave this wheel polished brass, spray-coated with protective clear Krylon. Thus, again, an old metal worker's friend's adage, if it can't be accurate, make it shiny. The supporting pedestal was turned from boxwood. 6 4 and 4.5-inch diameter winches were turned from aluminum. One of them is mounted on the deck extension at the V-berth hatch, blackened with alcohol-based Sharpie marker. 2 blackened spinnaker winches are mounted on the cockpit coaming. The bases for the 5-inch jib winches, which were molded into the cockpit coaming, were turned from boxwood on the lathe, and are such a length as to leave the bottoms exposed for maintenance and, as it turned out, the unintended access for an eventual wasp's nest in the cockpit side molding. Handrails for the cabin top were made from lengths of degame. Set 1/4 inch in from the edge of the cabin top, the rails were to follow its curve. Degame is a particularly stiff wood, so I had to steam the pieces for at least 10 minutes and then clamp them over a curved former to dry. I drilled them 0.5 millimeter through every other handhold post for bamboo trunnels to secure them in place on the cabin top. This slide shows the windows, cut from 1 millimeter acrylic, which were framed in 80 thou angle styrene strip. Installed after final painting, they were CA glued onto the outside of the cabin top wall. At the previous presentation, it was suggested that mica sheet might also be used for glazing. The finished model is mounted on 2 pedestals. The front pedestal is made from a length of 1/4 by 20 threaded brass rod, from which I turned off the thread for about 2.5 inches on my lathe to give a 15 thou diameter exposed length, with both ends threaded for securing in the hull and in the baseboard. The aft pedestal, providing more substantial lateral support, fits the thin black edge of the keel. Made from 3/16 of an inch thick pieces of cherry and lined with protective red baize, the style is copied from a previously restored historic model. The inner face of one side of this pedestal has a groove cut into it, hidden behind the baize, the purpose of which will be clarified later. Before finished painting the hull, a 3/32 inch cove bumper was pinned and glued following the sweep of the shear. It was carried round to the transom, where it's faced with an aluminum rubbing strip represented by a 1/32 inch wide length of matte silver tape. The hull had been primed and sanded early in the project to produce the basic smooth finish. Bumps and hollows were filled, and a second coat of white primer revealed any further defects. 2 coats of sanding sealer were applied, followed by a matte white coat. Sanding between all of these coats after a day's delay with 120, 180, and finally 220 grit sandpaper. 3 finishing gloss coats of Rust-Oleum gloss white from a rattle can then provided the final finish. I marked the waterline, then masked the hull and applied 2 coats of dark grey matte paint, simulating anti-fouling paint. After a couple of days and more masking, a blue boot stripe was added, spaced 3/32 of an inch above the top of the anti-fouling. The client selected Vivaldi font for the boat name, Beautiful Dreamer. I made decals for these at 24-point size for the bow position and a size slightly smaller at 22-point to fit across the transom. Then items such as winches and the pushpit and pulpit rails were left to be fixed until last. Now to the internal lighting. Until unknown to my client, I intended to light the interior of the boat. As mentioned earlier, the port side of the hull is fully planked, while the starboard side of the hull has an aperture to reveal the cabin interior. The hull shape is maintained visually by the cherry veneer frames. However, it would still be too dark to see inside clearly, so then the experimenting started. A length of 12-volt powered LED strip gave a very satisfactory natural white light. I found that a length to fit under the cabin top, 10 inches, could be driven by a 9-volt battery, even though it was described as 12-volt. I was concerned that this strip might have been too bright, but 4 1.5-volt AA batteries would not power the strip, so 9-volt it is. Then, how to locate the battery and conceal the wiring to the switch. These had to be accessible outside the case, so any wiring had to pass through the hull to the LEDs. A 5-unit length of my weekly medical pill organizers with hinged tops were covered with basswood strips and painted saga blue to look like deck boxes. A 9-volt battery was a comfortable fit inside 3 compartments, and a rocker switch fitted inside 2 separate compartments, connected by a short tube carrying the wiring. I mounted the boxes with double-sided tape onto a 1/4-inch thick rosewood extension screwed along one end of the baseboard, but I later reinforced the switch box fixings with a 632 stainless steel machine screw through the base. The wiring was run under the baseboard, then passed via the hidden groove running up one side of the aft pedestal, through a hidden small hole in the keel hull junction, slide into the cabin where I used butt splices to connect to the LED wiring. Each time I moved a fitting or made a connection, I checked the integrity of the LED wiring, remembering John Garnish's admonition at one of our presentations, never fix anything until it's inevitable and unavoidable. Because once the cabin top was fixed in place, the only internal electrical connection available for checking would be the butt splices. Even that meant rummaging about to reach them near the cabin entrance. Before the cabin top could be secured, the cabin fittings were fixed. Cabinets, bench seating, screen for the head itself, the shower screen, and the sink unit screen. The anchor is a Danforth design, which is most suitable for hard sand or mud, likely to occur in the lake and Caribbean sailing grounds. A friend of mine, Pat, offered to 3D print an anchor, and Alan found a detailed drawing of a Danforth anchor. Pat printed several superbly detailed resin anchors that only required painting to represent the aluminum casting of the real thing more closely. The anchor was fixed in the extreme bow, and I drilled a small hole at the apex of the deck cover and dropped a couple of links of an anchor chain through it. The baseboard is a 3/4-inch solid cherry with wave-like grain. I selected a length of 8-inch wide board and resawed one edge on my very accurately adjusted and tested table saw. I glued and clamped the sawn edge of two half-length boards together before cutting this wider board to the required 10-inch width and 28-inch length. The remaining cut-off widths provided the surrounding edging for the glazing groove. In view of the fast approaching deadline, I had decided to buy the acrylic cover, which cost me 180 Canadian dollars, compared to approximately $95 for sheet acrylic plus adhesive if I'd made it myself. I trimmed the baseboard about 1/8 of an inch in length and width to allow the board to fit very closely inside the cover. I fixed 1/4 high by 3/8 of an inch wide strips of basswood all around the base to form the bottom of the glazing groove, then glued and trunnelled 1/2-inch wide cherry moulding strips outside that, thus forming a groove into which the acrylic cover fitted. As usual, I made removable security pins to be fixed into holes drilled through each end of the moulding, through the bottom edge of the acrylic case and into the baseboard itself, to prevent damage if there was an attempt to lift the case by the cover. I added 6 bumper feet, themselves mounted on 1/4-inch thick pieces of ply, to ensure sufficient clearance height was available for the wiring. I screwed a 3-inch wide length of contrasting color rosewood across one end of the baseboard to mount the battery and switch boxes, and clipped and taped the wiring underneath. I continued to check the lights were working. To prevent the possibility of the rosewood splitting, if the case was mishandled by being lifted by it, I added a 1.5-inch long, 1/2-inch diameter polished brass rod, through drilled, to allow a number 10 by 2-inch stainless steel screw to be screwed through into the base, so that the rod lies flat against the rosewood and would take the load. I used 2-way tape to fix the nameplate to a 1-inch thick bevel-edged sub-base, which was in turn mounted on the baseboard. The quotation is a slightly modified version of the original, which was chosen by the client. The original says that ships rather than sailboats. Ships are the nearest thing to dreams that hands have ever made, for somewhere deep in their oaken hearts, the soul of a song is laid. So, the following slides show photos of the finished model. There it is outside the case with all the bits and pieces added on. Here it is shown on the port side, completely covered. It shows the aperture with all of the furnishings inside, and you can see how dark that is. Boom. That shows the lighted interior of the boat. And a bit of a close-up with the table inside there and the cabinets from a slightly different angle. Again, a slightly different angle. And here is a photo taken by the client herself. Strangely enough, for some reason, I didn't take a photograph of the finished boat inside its case. This one is taken inside the case, so you can see some slight reflections inside it. And there's the port side inside the case itself. On the right-hand side, you can see the mock deck boxes, and they're slightly above. The nameplate is on the right-hand side. Shows the display inside the client's house. A day after she picked up the model, she was rummaging around inside her father's possessions and found this drawing. And the drawing, in fact, is very close indeed to Thunderhead, which is the boat I showed you earlier on in this presentation. The principal differences that I could see would be the presence of the cover over the cabin entrance, which you can see at the top right-hand side there. It might have been easier if she'd been rummaging around a bit earlier, and I might have been able to find a decent drawing. However, that's how she's displaying it at the present time, together with the model with its lighted inside. And that is the story of Beautiful Dreamer. It was more than the usual model construction, given particularly the absence of drawings and the addition of the lighted interior. As usual, I dived in without giving too much thought to planning the details, but as with previous custom models, lessons are learned from the next one. The result is an example of approaching the job with a positive outlook, encouraged by its raison d'etre, and knowing that any hurdles can be overcome if you have a notebook at your bedside to write down the answers when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the middle of the night. The look on a client's face when they see the finished model says success and is the best reward for a job well done. And as a postscript, I heard from my client that after several unsuccessful attempts to sell the unfinished boat, it was acquired 1 week before it was to be disposed of in the local dump. The new owner intends to ship it back to Germany, where he will finish the job. And that's Beautiful Dreamer.